Hello to everybody who is watching this presentation. I hope you'll find it to be useful. My name is Greg Fisher, and I will be sharing some thoughts about doing cross-cultural Christian apologetics. And in the course of this video, I'm going to suggest three big barriers to doing Christian apologetics cross-culturally in places where literacy levels are quite low. And the three barriers I'm going to suggest may surprise you. So I would encourage you to hold on to the end of this video. Now, for me, I grew up in the Paleo-Pentecostal tradition, and it was common for us to hear things that would come from pastors and evangelists who'd be somewhat kind of based on a comment by Charles Finney when he said, defend the Bible. How would you defend a lion? Let it out of its cage and it will defend itself. So defending the truth of the Christian faith requires the discipline to learn the challenges raised by critics and the responses to those objections. And it requires us to develop critical thinking skills and an understanding of the laws of logics. But apologetics helps Christians to understand why they believe what they believe. All of this is a preparation for evangelism. Sharing one's faith requires an intimate understanding of the truth of the Christian faith. The apologetic discipline can help prepare Christians to share their faith with confidence. Unfortunately, as Braxton Hunter points out in his book about evangelistic apologetics, there's been a divorce between apologetics and evangelism. And this divorce between apologetics and evangelism is even more apparent in cross-cultural settings. Douglas Potter, an missions professor, observes the apologists must learn how to defend the Christian faith against false systems spawned by world religions in the light of cultural differences. John M. Beatty is sharing something with us here that relates to those cultural differences when he says, we cannot effectively carry out missions in a foreign language. Just as missionaries from overseas had to learn our language, so we must put the mission in a language that makes sense to those we missionize. In other words, we have to sing the gospel in our tunes set to our music played on our instruments. Now I speak metaphorically. We must drum it out with our great drums, on our tom-toms, on our waist-shaped drums, for only these can vibrate and awaken an entire village. The violin is too feeble to awaken the sleeping pagans of our society, and this applies equally in Africa as it does in Europe and America, where the gospel must be sung aloud. Beatty is a Kenyan theologian, philosopher, and an Anglican pastor, and he uses the imagery of the material culture in Africa to make the point that for Christianity to prosper, it must look and feel African. and presumably this would include defending the Christian faith against those who are opposing it. His observation, the violin is too feeble to awaken the sleeping pagans of our society. He's contrasting the high church, refined Christian faith of the Reformation with an instrument that is so out of place in an African village, it would have very little impact. Now, to begin, let's take a brief look at Christian apologetics as it is done in the West. Christian apologetics here in America really began to come to the forefront starting in the late 1940s and early 1950s after World War II. And Bernard Bram, who was an early Christian apologist in the 20th century, suggested that there were three different kinds or systems of Christian apologetics. And he broke them down by saying in this way: the systems that stress the uniqueness of grace and salvation. And this would be pretty much analogous with what today we would call Reformed apologetics. And then systems stressing natural theology. And this would be analogous to what we today call classical apologetics. And finally, systems stressing the primacy of revelation. And this would be more informed, kind of presuppositional apologetics. Now, looking at these this taxonomy of apologetic methodologies, which is based upon their preeminent argumentative style, classical apologetics starts with a level epistemological playing field with non-believers, that is, things upon which both sides can agree. Then moves to using natural theology and historiography of the modern world. The classical apologist demonstrates the soundness of the theistic worldview. This is a two-step approach to doing apologetics. And it would be identified with people like Braxton Hunter, William Lane Craig, Norman Geisler, and others. Then there's evidentialist apologetics. Evidentialists start with the miraculous and then argue for the system of God, for the existence of God based on the miracle. And the most common event that is used by evidential apologetics is the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. This is a one-step approach to doing Christian apologetics and garners some criticism from classical apologists. But evidential apologetics would be, maybe in our mind, associated with Josh McDowell and his book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. That is evidential apologetics. Cumulative case apologetics has apologetic arguments that are building a cumulative case for the truth of a particular belief or claim. So it's not the overall general claim of theism, but rather selecting a particular part of Christian belief or a particular claim that the Holy Bible makes, and then rather than relying on a single decisive argument, cumulative case apologetics aims to show that a particular belief or claim is more reasonable and coherent than any alternative hypothesis when considering all the available evidence. Now, critics oftentimes refer to this as the leaky buckets, because no particular belief or claim is going to be defended to the very bitter end. Rather, it's going to be defended as a case, then another case, then another case. And critics will point out these are all leaky buckets because they all have flaws to them. And so that was one of the criticisms about cumulative case apologetics. And then finally, presuppositional apologetics. At the very basis, presuppositionalists are not very optimistic, and maybe even negative about what reason, apart from special revelation, can achieve. This would also be closer to Reformed apologetics. But this inability to understand apart from special revelation is what Braxton Hunter refers to as cognitive fallenness. So presuppositional apologetics focuses on demonstrating how the Christian theism better accounts for reality than other worldviews. Now, let's take a look at the challenge of doing Christian apologetics in a non-Christian, non-Western, and non-Christian part of the world. Suppose a person with a newly minted doctorate in apologetics and culture pitches up alone in a remote African village with only her English Bible as a resource, and she's been sent to train village pastors to defend the faith. How's she going to succeed? And what obstacles is she going to find? And is this even a reasonable expectation? Now, Benno Ventorin, in his book Cross-Cultural Apologetics, notes that all human life is culturally embedded. We realize this with a shock when we come to live in another culture and discover how differently other people relate to the world, to life, and to others. So let's start with what we know and then move to what we don't know. What we already know is that Christian apologetics is an essential discipline in the Christian life and faith for several reasons. Apologetics training can help Christians to defend their faith against challenges and objections. And this is the core of what we hope to do cross-culturally, is to train and help Christians to defend their faith against the challenges and objections that arise in their context. But that will also play into what we don't know. Apologetics can help Christians to grow in their understanding of the faith. Apologetics can help people to live more faithfully in the world that they find themselves in. Apologetics can help people to learn to think critically about matters of importance. One of the great things about Christian apologetics training is that basic to the whole idea of apologetics, especially here in the West, is the ability to think critically. And that is something we can learn and appreciate from Christian apologetics. Apologetics can help Christians to share their faith with other people and also to build bridges to people of other faiths. But what we don't know how to do is we don't know how to do Christian apologetics in a cross-cultural setting. Ebenezer Afolabi, in his book, writes, "It's regrettable to say that most of the publications from the American and European apologists were not written from the African perspective. Most writers of Christian apologetics do not write from the socio-cultural, socio-economic, and socio-political realities of Africans. This makes Christian apologetics, as a Christian discipline, to be unappealing to Africans." Now that's a powerful statement about Africa and about Christian apologetics. And the question would be, does this also apply in other cultures, other places, and other languages? The first big consideration that I want to put out is, first we must consider the literacy. Literacy and non-literacy is a long ignored issue in the domain that Afolabi calls sociocultural. Christians and the rest focus on reading the text, and we think that the ability to read the scriptures is essential to Christian growth and Christian leadership. So, Western apologetics seems to have kind of a geek squad appearance that bypasses anyone not literate enough to understand the subtleties of Western logical argument. One must ask, how large a problem is this? And will non-literacy actually impact the spread of the gospel and the defense of the truth of God's word? Well, I'm going to share some statistics with you, which may be shocking and sobering in our minds as we begin to think about doing this kind of cross-cultural ministry. The statistics I'm sharing come from ourworldindata.org, which is a great resource for data, and I went there to see the data on literacy. Here's something shocking. 21% of the American adults are not literate. That means that there are 45 million adults in the United States alone that can't read. Now that sounds surprising because we tend to think of ourselves as being very sophisticated and highly educated and really at the top of our game. But we're not. 21% of American adults are not literate. 54% of our nation reads at a 6th grade level or lower. That's bordering on functional illiteracy. It means they wouldn't be able to read a technical manual. They wouldn't be able to read and comprehend, for example, a manual that would come with a very expensive camera. Someone reading at a 6th grade level or lower would do really well with smartphones because they are mainly icon operated, and that's the interface. So a lot of people in the more non-literate classes of people will rely on smartphones quite a bit. But regardless, 54% of our nation is still reading at a 6th grade level or lower. That means that only 79% is our literacy rate. And a 79% literacy rate places the United States below Zimbabwe, Swaziland, and Gabon. But there's a more shocking statistic that we need to look at, and that's this. 4 billion. That's the number of people unable to access any form of written material worldwide. 4 billion. Let that sink in. 90% of our mission spending, our mission support, goes to projects that are literate. Very little goes to projects that help with non-literacy. Herbert Clem, who was a professor at Bethel College, it's now a university, and a former missionary to Nigeria, was writing in the International Journal of Frontier Missions clear back in 1995 and suggested that 50% of the world's population was non-literate. And he went on to say, modern missions are about 200 years old. Most of us involved in this movement have always thought of the Bible as the main book for communication. We believed and taught that a person has to learn the Bible for himself or herself in order to become spiritually mature. Many of us believe that as long as people do not read, they will remain spiritually immature and indeed cannot become leaders in churches. Now, fortunately, developments in mission communication since 1995 have demonstrated that Dr. Clem's observation is a bit ethnocentrically flawed. But here are some of the issues. Illiteracy makes people more vulnerable to manipulation. And this is one of the reasons why non-literacy levels continue to be so high in some countries. The government realizes that literate people are able to think critically and are harder to manipulate. When access to religious texts is limited then illiterate individuals rely on intermediaries such as church leaders or influential figures to interpret and communicate the teachings of the Bible. Here's an example. The Word of Faith teaching has for a long time been popular with the revelational churches in Africa. And by revelational churches, I'm talking about some of the grassroots African-initiated churches that depend upon leaders and elders having momentary revelation to share with the church that's almost on the same level as reading it from the scriptures. But the Word of Faith teaching, with his emphasis on verbal proclamation and positive confession, can resonate with non-literate individuals because it is easy for them to grasp. It is easy for them to remember the few proof texts that the Word of Faith teaching is based upon. So without the ability to engage critically with written materials, these believers rely on the interpretation by church leaders. And this reliance automatically exposes them to manipulative or exploitative practices by individuals who use their position for personal gain. And all of us that have had any kind of background in Africa are familiar with that particular problem. And then we make either consciously or unconsciously, when we equate literacy with intelligence, we make a huge mistake. And that's one of the issues. As literate people, even literate African people, can assume, as we often do, that people who are not literate are also lower in intelligence. That's not true, and I can demonstrate how huge a mistake that is. And that is M-Pesa. M-Pesa is kind of a conglomerate Kiswahili word. M for mobile and Pesa for pay or money. So it would be mobile money. And this is how non-literates started their own informal banking system. In Kenya, Safaricom, a cell phone operator in Kenya, offered a new service. You could send minutes of airtime, transfer from your phone to family and friends who couldn't afford to buy the refill cards. And that way, you could continue to keep track of your family back in the village by quickly sending them some minutes so that you could talk by telephone. But people quickly realized that minutes could be transferred, they could be held, and they could be sold. And so this made minutes a medium of exchange. And very quickly, this feature of Safaricom became an informal banking system. Now, the great thing about it was this developed from the grassroots. This developed back on the village level, not at the corporate level. It didn't require an app to install on your phone. It can be done with the simplest cell phone because it was all SMS text based. And all of this was done informally, kind of in the underground, by people in Kenya from 2002 to 2007. And it became a way, it was the informal way to pay people. You could, if you had extra cash, you don't want it laying around. You don't want to carry it because people can rob you. You go down, you use your cash to buy extra time cards. You scratch, you enter. Now the time is on your phone. Later, if you need the cash back, you can sell those minutes to someone else for cash, and you have your cash in your hand again. All of this was being done informally. And then in 2007, Safaricom formalized this with developing the M-Pesa system. And a study done by MIT and Georgetown University finds that from 2008 to 2016, M-Pesa has lifted over 194,000 families, or 2% of the Kenyan households, out of extreme poverty. Let me move that over. In 2016, this is only 8 years or so after M-Pesa was formalized, more than 10.3 million transactions were being done on M-Pesa every day. Flash forward to March of 2022, and 15 years, it has now grown to 51 million customers, 465,000 businesses. They have 600,000 agents in the field and 42,000 developers across Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Lesotho, Ghana, and Egypt. And it is processing 61 million transactions a day, which is making it Africa's biggest financial tech provider. All of this started with the innovation that was done by primarily semi-literate and non-literate people from the beginning. Now we need to go to the second big consideration, and that's going to be culture. Obstacles to cross-cultural Christian apologetics. There are cultural differences. This is our second big barrier. And we have to ask the question, what is culture? And how does culture relate to the worldview of a people group? Can people change their worldview? Well, here's the problem. The terms culture and worldview are owned by two different disciplines, philosophy and anthropology. And each discipline has a different definition, and so that creates some confusion. Now, both philosophers and anthropologists acknowledge that worldviews are not static, but are shaped and influenced by various factors such as culture, history, language, and personal experience. This is where the similarities end. Charles Kraft sees culture as society's complex integrated coping mechanism belonging to and operated by a society, a social group, consisting of learned patterns, concepts, and behavior, plus the underlying perspectives or worldview and the resulting artifacts or material culture. On the other hand, Ronald Nash, who's writing from a philosophical point of view, is saying that when faced with competing touchstone propositions of different worldviews, we should choose the one that, when applied to the whole of reality, gives us the most coherent picture of the world. Those are two vastly different definitions. In philosophy, the worldview is a set of mental categories arising from deeply lived experience, which essentially determines how a person understands, feels, and responds in action to what he or she perceives of as the surrounding world and the riddles that it presents. Anthropologist Charles Kraft sees worldview as the coping mechanism, but it results in a material culture. So for missionary anthropologists, worldview and culture are inseparable, and they operate at a much deeper level of being than the worldview constructed by philosophers. So how does one go about analyzing a worldview? Well, for a missionary anthropologist, this begins by making an ethnography of the people under study. An ethnography requires the researcher to observe the people group and participate in their daily activities as much as possible. Observers gain trust of some of the individuals, and they begin to ask questions about the behaviors and practices that they're seeing. And from this, the researcher begins to assemble a model of the worldview being studied. This is an example of a worldview that I started to assemble years ago in Ghana, in which we were looking at how do Ghanaians experience their reality. And their reality has at the top Onyame, the high god, and Onyame has no shrines, no priesthood, and it is always said, nobody speaks for Onyame. He is very, very distant from the people, having been offended by the actions of a woman eons ago. And so now rules the whole cosmos through lesser deities. And that is how Onyame is administrating the creation. Beneath the lesser deities are shrine gods who do both good and evil, depending on what is needed at the time. And also beneath the lesser deities is witchcraft, demons, curses, and fetishes. Beneath all of those, in kind of a broader band, would be, like they would be at the base of a triangle, are the ancestors. All of the people in the Ashanti tribe are still Ashantis, even though they've gone on into ancestorhood. So that's an example of the beginning of a diagram of a worldview. The third big consideration is that sometimes we're answering questions that nobody's asking. Preparing our grassroots apologists to make a defense against atheism is an example of answering an objection that may not exist in the context. In fact, you would almost find it impossible to find a person living at the village level in Africa who's an atheist. People are born with an understanding that there is a supreme God. Questions that are being asked would be things like, isn't Christianity a foreign religion that was brought to Africa by Europeans? Or isn't Christianity incompatible with African traditional beliefs and practices? And how would we manage that tension? Isn't Christianity a religion of oppression? And one of the things that would be asked in the Christian community would be, how can we defend Christianity against Islam? So when we begin to look at equipping grassroots Christian apologists, questions like these come from the cultural linguistic context. But our training has to take into consideration things like lack of resources and whether people are literate or not literate, and whether they have developed good critical thinking skills or whether we have to push them to learn to think things through. And the answer is not in lowering the bar for them, but encouraging them to push for the highest levels. Trainers need to be like football coaches or soccer coaches who have the players' respect, but push them mercilessly to a higher level of thinking. So the technology used should be limited to what's available to the participants. The widespread of cell phones and smartphones is going to make this a lot easier to do, and it does open up resources for training. The course of study has to have standards and measurable objectives for students to meet by the end of the course. Trainers have to be able to outline the topics of the course with these objectives in mind. A course should require 30 hours of classroom instruction. In the past, I've done this over a 5 or 6 day period. When I was doing it, I would teach for 30 hours. So that would be 6 hours every day for 5 days. And then an additional 2 hours every evening dialoguing with students about things that they started to think about, issues that arise from the instruction. But in this case, that's very exhausting. So 1/3 of the hours of the 30 should be spent in engaging the students in dialogue, and it would all be within that 30 hours. It could also be spread out over a number of weeks, like 10 weeks. The only textbook to be used should be the Bible, because this may be the only book or resource that many students can access. And remember, some of our students may not even be literate. So we would be limited. The students at the end should be required to go back to their context, go back to their village, and do something, a project, an activity that integrates what they've learned from the course, and then give us a report back on what those results were looking like. And finally, doing apologetics cross-culturally is almost ignored by the apologetics community. There are very few written resources that even entertain a cross-cultural apologetic. In Africa, my friend Ebenezer Afolabi, Korede Olawoyan, and others have started writing and using YouTube to show Christian apologetics through African eyes. American apologists need to read and hear these men as they think about doing apologetics cross-culturally.